The old house on the hill had always been a mystery. No one knew who lived there, or what secrets the house held. But when a group of friends decided to explore the abandoned property, they got more than they bargained for. As they crept through the overgrown yard, the group of friends felt an eerie sense of foreboding. The house looked dark and ominous, and the air was thick with an unexplainable tension. But despite their fear, they pushed on, determined to uncover the secrets of the old house. As they entered the house, they saw that it was in a state of disrepair. Cobwebs covered the corners, and dust coated the floors. But despite its dilapidated state, the house was still full of mysterious artifacts and antique objects. The group of friends explored the house room by room, searching for anything that might reveal the history of the old house. But as they moved deeper into the house, they began to feel as though they were being watched. The feeling of being watched soon turned into something more sinister. As they reached the top floor, the friends heard strange noises and whispers coming from behind a closed door. They hesitated, but the curiosity got the best of them, and they opened the door. What they found inside was a room that had clearly not been touched for decades. Dust and cobwebs covered everything, but what really caught their eye was the old wardrobe in the corner. It was covered in chains and padlocks, as if it had been sealed shut for a very long time. Despite the sense of dread that was building within them, the friends couldn't resist investigating the wardrobe. They tried to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. That's when they noticed something strange. The walls around the wardrobe seemed to be shifting and changing. Suddenly, the friends realized they were not alone in the room. Figures began to emerge from the walls, spectral apparitions of people from long ago. The friends screamed and tried to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The figures moved closer and closer, their faces twisted in anger and hatred. The friends huddled together, praying that they would make it out alive. And then, just when all seemed lost, the door burst open, and they were free. As they ran from the house, the friends heard a voice whispering in their ears, warning them never to come back. They never did, but the memory of that terrifying experience stayed with them forever. Julie had always been fascinated by the abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. The asylum had been closed for years, and it was said to be haunted by the ghosts of the patients who had been mistreated there. Julie had always wanted to explore the abandoned building, and one night, she finally got her chance. As she walked through the asylum's dark and dusty halls, Julie felt an eerie sense of foreboding. The air was thick with the smells of mold and decay, and the only sound was the echo of her footsteps. But as she turned a corner, Julie saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure stood in front of her, its face twisted and contorted in a grotesque expression. It was one of the ghosts, come back to haunt the asylum. Julie tried to run, but the ghost was too quick. It grabbed her by the arm, pulling her towards it. The ghost's touch was icy cold, and Julie could feel its anger and rage. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the ghost disappeared. Julie was left alone, shaken but unharmed. She thought it was over, but then she heard a sound that made her heart race. The sound was a faint whisper, but it grew louder and louder until Julie could make out the words. "Get out," the voice said, "before it's too late." Julie tried to run, but the doors of the asylum were locked. She was trapped, alone in the darkness with the ghosts. As she huddled in a corner, praying for a way out, she heard something that made her heart skip a beat. It was the sound of footsteps, coming closer and closer. Julie held her breath, waiting for the worst. But then, a hand reached out to her, guiding her to safety. It was the caretaker of the asylum, who had heard Julie's screams and come to investigate. He unlocked the doors and led her out of the asylum, away from the ghosts and the horrors of the past. Julie never went back to the asylum again, but the memory of that night stayed with her for the rest of her life. She knew that there were some places that were better left unexplored, and some mysteries that were better left unsolved. When Sarah moved into her new house, she thought she had found the perfect home. It was a beautiful old Victorian house with a lot of character, and it was located in a quiet neighborhood. But soon after she moved in, she started to experience strange occurrences that left her feeling uneasy. At first, it was just little things, like objects moving on their own or strange noises in the middle of the night. But then, Sarah began to see apparitions in the house, shadowy figures that moved in the corners of her vision and disappeared when she turned to look at them. Sarah tried to ignore the strange occurrences, telling herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the more she tried to dismiss the occurrences, the more they escalated. One night, Sarah woke up to find a ghostly figure standing at the foot of her bed. The figure was a woman, dressed in a white dress, with long black hair that covered her face. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure approached her slowly, until it was hovering right over her. Suddenly, the figure vanished, leaving Sarah gasping for breath. But the next night, it was back again, and the night after that. Each time, it seemed to be getting closer and closer to Sarah. Sarah tried to leave the house, but something kept pulling her back. She felt as though the house had a hold over her, as though it was trying to keep her there. And then, one night, she discovered the reason why. In the basement of the house, Sarah found an old trunk filled with old letters and photographs. The letters told the story of a woman who had lived in the house many years before. Her name was Emily, and she had been in love with a man who had betrayed her. Emily had never been able to leave the house, even after her death, and she was now trapped there, haunting anyone who tried to live in the house. Sarah knew then that she had to leave the house. She packed her bags and left that very night, never to return. But she knew that the memory of Emily would stay with her forever, haunting her dreams and reminding her of the dangers of living in a house with a dark past. The town of Blackwood had always been a quiet and peaceful place, until the night that the fog rolled in. It started slowly, a thick mist that crept through the streets and alleys, but soon it had grown into a suffocating blanket that covered the entire town. At first, the residents of Blackwood thought it was just a natural phenomenon, nothing to be afraid of. But as the days passed, the fog seemed to take on a life of its own. It moved in unnatural ways, twisting and curling like tendrils of smoke. And then, people started to disappear. At first, it was just a few here and there, but soon it was dozens. The fog seemed to swallow them up, leaving no trace of their existence. The remaining residents of Blackwood were terrified, holed up in their homes and praying that they wouldn't be the next to disappear. But then, one night, there was a knock at the door of every house in the town. The people who opened the doors found themselves face to face with a figure dressed in black, with eyes that glowed like hot coals. The figure spoke in a whisper, promising to spare the residents if they gave it something in return. And so, the people of Blackwood made a pact with the figure in black. They offered it their most precious possessions, their loved ones, and even their own souls. And for a time, the fog lifted, and the town returned to some semblance of normalcy. But the figure in black always returns, demanding more and more from the people of Blackwood. And so they live in a constant state of fear, waiting for the day when the fog will return, and they will once again have to make a terrible sacrifice to keep a figure at bay. The old house on the hill had always been shrouded in mystery. It was a dilapidated mansion, with boarded-up windows and a large gate that was always locked. But when a group of teenagers decided to explore the house, they got more than they bargained for. As they made their way through the overgrown gardens, the teenagers felt a sense of foreboding. The house seemed to loom over them, and the air was thick with an unexplainable tension. But despite their fear, they pushed on, determined to uncover the secrets of the house. As they entered the house, they heard strange noises and whispers coming from the dark corners. But the teenagers ignored the warning signs, eager to discover what lay ahead. And then, Suddenly, one of them disappeared. The other teenagers searched frantically for their friend, calling out his name, but there was no answer. As they searched, they heard a sound that made their blood run cold, the sound of someone whispering their names. The teenagers followed the sound, their hearts pounding with fear, until they reached the basement of the house. And there, they found their friend, tied to a chair and surrounded by dark figures with glowing eyes. The figures turned to face the teenagers, and they saw that their eyes were not human, they were the eyes of demons. The teenagers tried to run, but the figures were too fast. They were trapped, with no way out. And then, the figures started to chant, in a language the teenagers could not understand. The room started to shake, and the walls began to bleed. The teenagers screamed, but their screams were drowned out by the deafening roar of the demons. And then, suddenly, the room was quiet. The demons were gone, and the teenagers were left alone in the basement of the old house. But they knew that they would never forget the horror they had witnessed, and they would never be the same again. The abandoned amusement park had always been a source of fascination for the locals. It was an old park that had been shut down for years, with rusted rides and overgrown pathways. But one group of teenagers decided to explore the park, thinking it would be an adventure. As they walked through the park, they noticed something strange. The rides seemed to be moving on their own. The Ferris wheel was turning, the bumper cars were moving, and the roller coaster was creaking along the track. But there was no one there to operate them. The teenagers were scared, but they pushed on, thinking it was just their imagination playing tricks on them. But then, they heard a sound that made their blood run cold, the sound of children laughing. The teenagers followed the sound, thinking that maybe there were kids playing in the park. But as they turned a corner, they saw something that made them freeze in terror. They were children, but they were not normal children. They were pale, with empty eyes and twisted limbs. And they were all staring at the teenagers with a hungry look in their eyes. The teenagers tried to run, but the children were too fast. They chased the teenagers through the park, their laughter turning into high-pitched screams. The teenagers stumbled and fell, but the children kept coming, their fingers clawing at the air. And then, suddenly, the park was quiet. The teenagers were gone, and the children disappeared into the shadows. But the locals knew that they would never forget the horror they had witnessed in the abandoned amusement park. And they would never go near that place again. The old house on the hill had always been shrouded in mystery. People said it was cursed, that anyone who entered never came back out. But one group of friends dared each other to spend the night in the house, thinking it would be a thrill. As they explored the house, they noticed something strange. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the air was thick with the scent of incense. They didn't know what it meant, but it made them uneasy. As they settled down for the night, they heard a sound coming from the attic. It was a soft whisper, barely audible, but it was there. The friends tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the wind. But then, the whisper grew louder, until it was a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. The friends were terrified, and they huddled together in fear. They tried to leave, but the doors were locked, and the windows were barred. They were trapped in the house, with the voices growing louder and more frantic by the minute. And then, the friends saw something that made their blood run cold. It was a figure, draped in black, with eyes that glowed like fire. It moved slowly towards them, with a low, menacing growl. The friends were paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. And then, suddenly, the figure was gone, and the voices disappeared. The friends stumbled out of the house, their minds shattered by the horror they had witnessed. They never spoke of that night again, but the memory haunted them for the rest of their lives. And the old house on the hill remained a place of darkness and terror, a place where the dead never truly rested. The small town had always been quiet, but there was a rumor that circulated around the residents. There was a house at the edge of town that was said to be haunted. It was an old, run-down place that had been abandoned for years. But one day, a family moved in, ignoring the warnings of their neighbors. As the family settled into the house, strange things began to happen. Doors would open and close on their own, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the halls. The family tried to brush it off, thinking it was just their imagination. But then, they saw something that made their blood run cold. It was a figure, draped in black, with glowing red eyes. The family was terrified, and they tried to leave, but the doors were locked, and the windows were barred. They were trapped in the house with the ghostly figure, which seemed to be getting more and more aggressive by the minute. And then, the family realized that the ghost was not alone. There were others, trapped in the house, their souls unable to rest. They were screaming, begging for release, but the family couldn't help them. They were too frightened, too overwhelmed by the horror that surrounded them. In the end, the family was never seen again. But the house remained, a place of darkness and despair, a place where the dead and the living were forever intertwined. And the people of the small town knew better than to go near that house, knowing that the spirits within would claim anyone who dared to enter. The forest was always a mysterious and eerie place, but no one could have predicted what was lurking in the shadows. A group of friends had gone on camping, thinking it would be a fun and adventurous weekend. But as the night fell, they realized they were not alone. They could hear the sound of footsteps, but no one was there. They could see a shadowy figure lurking in the distance, but as they approached, it vanished into thin air. And then, they heard a voice, whispering in their ears, promising them a fate worse than death. The friends were terrified, and they tried to leave, but they couldn't find their way out. The trees seemed to close in on them, blocking out the moonlight and the stars. They were lost, trapped in the forest with the unknown entity that seemed to be stalking them. As the night wore on, the friends became more and more desperate. They were cold and hungry, and they could feel the presence of the entity growing stronger. And then, suddenly, it attacked. It was a figure, with eyes that glowed like embers, and claws that glinted in the darkness. The friends tried to fight back, but they were no match for the entity's strength. It was like fighting against a shadow, a force that could not be defeated. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the entity was gone. The friends stumbled out of the forest, their minds shattered by the horror they had witnessed. They knew they had come face to face with something beyond their understanding, something that had claimed them as its own. And the forest remained a place of darkness and terror, a place where the entity roamed, waiting for its next victim to cross its path.